I'm Amanda Blake, 32 years old, and I never expected to witness my own family's implosion in the mahogany-paneled library of our family estate. The lawyer had just announced that my parents had secretly transferred the $5 million inheritance meant for all of us siblings to my younger sister Jillian. My breath caught as Grandpa Harold, who everyone thought was bedridden and barely lucid, suddenly stood up from his wheelchair. His eyes clear and sharp, he said 7 words that froze the blood in my veins. "I know exactly what you've been doing." That's when I realized my entire childhood had been built on lies. Before I continue with what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. This family betrayal completely changed my understanding of blood loyalty, and I'm still processing how one moment transformed our entire family dynamic. If you've ever felt that sting of family betrayal, hit that like button and subscribe to know what my grandfather did next that left my parents speechless. Trust me, karma came for them in the most unexpected way. To understand the magnitude of what happened that day in the library, you need to know about the Blake family. We weren't just wealthy. We were Connecticut old money, with the kind of privilege that comes from generations of financial security. My parents, Richard and Diane Blake, presided over our family like benevolent dictators, always reminding us how fortunate we were to be born into such prosperity. Our family consisted of 5 members: my father Richard, the calculating businessman with a Harvard MBA; my mother Diane, the perfect socialite who managed our family's image with military precision; my brother Ethan, for years younger than me and the designated family rebel; my sister Jillian, the baby of the family at 25, and me, Amanda, the eldest at 32. From my earliest memories, Jillian was different. When she was born, the dynamic in our home shifted noticeably. While I had baby pictures stored in simple albums in the attic, Jillian had professional portraits hanging in the main hallway. Her birthday parties were extravagant affairs with petting zoos and professional entertainers, while mine had been simple gatherings with a few friends from school. The pattern continued as we grew older. "Jillian has your father's business instinct," my mother would say, even though Jillian showed little interest in anything beyond social media and shopping until much later. Meanwhile, I was graduating summa cum laude and actively pursuing business courses with the hope of joining Blake Real Estate Holdings, the company my grandfather Harold had built from nothing. Grandpa Harold was my refuge in the family. While my parents attended Ethan's rock band performances out of obligation and Jillian's ballet recitals with genuine enthusiasm, Grandpa Harold would sit front row at my debate competitions and business school presentations. He recognized something in me that my parents seemed determined to ignore. "You remind me of myself at your age," he told me once as we walked the grounds of Lakeview Manor, our family estate overlooking the Connecticut shoreline. "You've got the hunger to build something, not just inherit it." Grandpa Harold's story was legendary in our family. He had started with a single rundown apartment building in the 1960s and gradually expanded to develop luxury properties across New England. By the time he handed day-to-day operations to my father 15 years ago, Blake Real Estate Holdings was worth over $100 million. I worshipped him. While my father focused on maintaining what was already built, Grandpa Harold had been a true visionary. He taught me that wealth wasn't just about accumulation, but about creating value where none existed before. My parents' dismissal of my business ambitions became more pronounced after I graduated from Wharton. Despite my qualifications, my father gave me a minor role managing a small division of rental properties rather than the development position I had hoped for. "Property management will be good experience," he said patronizingly. "Development requires a certain instinct that can't be taught in school." The irony was that Jillian, who had barely passed her business classes at a state university, was immediately given a vice president title and access to development projects upon her graduation. The favoritism couldn't have been more obvious. When I met David in my late 20s, he provided perspective that my family bubble had never allowed. A dedicated high school English teacher with a passion for literature, David saw through the Blake family dynamics immediately. "They're grooming Jillian for something," he observed after our 3rd family dinner together. "And they're deliberately sidelining you." I defended my parents initially, making excuses about how Jillian needed more support or how perhaps they saw something in her that I couldn't recognize. But deep down, I knew David was right. The question was why? Why would my parents so obviously favor their youngest child when I had done everything right? When David proposed, my parents' reaction was tepid at best. My mother arranged a modest engagement dinner at the country club, nothing like the extravaganza I knew would have been planned had Jillian become engaged to someone from their social circle. A teacher? Really, Amanda? My mother had whispered when she thought I couldn't hear her speaking to my father. She could have had her pick of the Ashton boy or the Winthrop heir. David and I married anyway, buying a modest colonial home 30 minutes from Lakeview Manor. I continued working for the family business, trying to prove my worth despite the glass ceiling my parents had installed above me. Meanwhile, Jillian flitted from department to department within the company, receiving praise for the most basic accomplishments while my successes were treated as expected. Ethan, for his part, wanted nothing to do with real estate. He pursued music with a passion that both irritated and relieved our parents. Irritated because it wasn't the path they had envisioned for their son, but relieved because it meant he wasn't competing for control of the family empire. That battle, it seemed, was solely between Jillian and me, though the playing field was far from level. Through it all, Grandpa Harold remained my champion. He would invite me to lunch regularly, asking pointed questions about the business and nodding approvingly at my observations. As I entered my 30s, I began to hope that perhaps when the time came for the next leadership transition, Grandpa's influence might tip the scales in my favor despite my parents' obvious preference for Jillian. Little did I know that a far more complex game was being played behind the scenes, one that would eventually expose the rotten core at the center of the Blake family fortune. 2 years before everything fell apart, Grandpa Harold began to decline. At first, it was subtle. Forgetting names, misplacing his reading glasses, telling the same story twice in one afternoon. Given that he was 84, no one was particularly alarmed. Age catches up with everyone eventually. But by the following spring, his decline accelerated dramatically. He moved from his wing of Lakeview Manor into a suite specially outfitted with medical equipment. A full-time nurse was hired, and family visits became scheduled affairs rather than casual drop-ins. Despite my increasingly demanding work schedule, I made time to visit Grandpa Harold at least twice a week. I would bring fresh flowers for his room and sit beside his bed, updating him on the business even though my parents insisted he could no longer follow complex conversations. "He finds comfort in your voice," my mother would say dismissively. "But don't bother him with business matters. Dr. Reynolds says stress could worsen his condition." There were moments during those visits when I could have sworn Grandpa was more lucid than everyone claimed. His eyes would sharpen when I mentioned certain properties or deals, and occasionally he would ask surprisingly specific questions before lapsing back into vague pleasantries. I mentioned these moments to my father once, who dismissed them as sundowning, temporary periods of clarity common in dementia patients. As Grandpa's health apparently worsened, I noticed significant changes in the family business. My father began restructuring departments, moving trusted employees to different positions and bringing in new executives from outside the company, something the Blakes had rarely done. When I questioned these moves in management meetings, I was told they were preparing for the future and that the changes had Grandpa Harold's blessing. More concerning were the closed-door meetings between my parents and Lawrence Peterson, the family's longtime attorney. 3 times I arrived at Lakeview Manor to visit Grandpa, only to find Peterson leaving the study with folders of documents. When I asked my mother about these meetings, she vaguely mentioned estate planning and ensuring a smooth transition. Around this time, Jillian suddenly developed an intense interest in the family business. After years of treating her VP title as little more than an excuse for a corner office and company credit card, she began attending every meeting, taking notes, and spending time with the financial officers. The transformation was jarring. "I've realized how important Grandpa's legacy is," she told me over lunch one day, her voice syrupy with false sincerity. "Dad's been mentoring me privately. He says I have a natural talent for the big picture stuff." I tried discussing my concerns with Ethan during one of his rare visits home from Los Angeles, where he was trying to get his band signed to a major label. "Something feels off about all of this," I said as we shared a bottle of wine on the terrace of my home. Dad's making major company changes, without proper consultation. Jillian's suddenly acting like she's in waiting. And they're limiting access to Grandpa Harold. Ethan shrugged, twirling his wine glass between his fingers. You're being paranoid, Mandy. Dad's always been a control freak, and Jillian's just trying to impress them as usual. As for Grandpa, he's old and sick. It sucks, but it's not some conspiracy. But my suspicions continued to grow, especially after I accidentally discovered documents in my father's office while searching for quarterly reports. I hadn't meant to snoop, but the folder labeled Succession Planning, Confidential, was sitting open on his desk. Inside were draft documents transferring significant assets from Grandpa Harold's personal holdings directly to Jillian, bypassing both Ethan and me. When my father found me looking at the documents, his face flushed with anger. Those are private family matters, Amanda, he snapped, snatching the folder from my hands. Private family matters that apparently don't include me? I countered, my voice shakier than I intended. Your grandfather and I have made decisions based on what's best for the company's future, he said coldly. Not everyone has the right temperament for wealth management. The conversation ended there, but the tension between us grew in the following months. I began documenting everything I observed, changes in company structure, unusual financial movements, the timing of my parents' meetings with Peterson. David thought I was becoming obsessive, but something deep in my gut told me that what was happening wasn't right. The last Christmas, before the will reading, was particularly strained. We gathered at Lakeview Manor as always, with Grandpa Harold brought downstairs for the traditional gift exchange. He seemed particularly foggy that evening, barely recognizing Ethan and calling Jillian by my name several times. Yet when everyone else was occupied with dessert, I could have sworn I saw him watching my father with an expression that looked nothing like confusion. It looked like calculation. As we were leaving that night, Jillian pulled me aside with unusual sisterly affection. You should really start thinking about your future beyond Blake Holdings, she said, squeezing my arm. You and David could move anywhere with your business degree. Haven't you ever wanted to try something completely different? The warning couldn't have been clearer if she'd spelled it out. They were planning to push me out, and they wanted me to go quietly. Little did they know that the reading of Grandpa Harold's will would upend all their careful plans in ways none of us could have imagined. The day of Grandpa Harold's will reading dawned bright and clear, the kind of crisp autumn morning that normally would have lifted my spirits. David squeezed my hand reassuringly as we drove through the ornate gates of Lakeview Manor. Neither of us spoke the fear aloud, that today would officially mark my exclusion from the family business and possibly from the family fortune altogether. Whatever happens, David said as we parked beside my father's Bentley, we have each other. And we have a good life regardless of what your parents decide. The grand library of Lakeview Manor had always been my favorite room in the house. 2 stories of leather-bound books, a massive stone fireplace, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake created an atmosphere of timeless elegance. Today, however, the room felt suffocating. My father stood by the fireplace, looking imperial in a tailored charcoal suit. My mother perched on a leather wingback chair, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her expression appropriately somber. Jillian sat nearby, dressed in an expensive black dress that seemed calculated to suggest mourning despite the fact that Grandpa Harold was very much alive, if unwell. Grandpa himself was there, which surprised me. Wheeled in by his nurse, he sat slumped in a specialized wheelchair, a plaid blanket across his knees despite the warmth of the room. His once commanding presence had diminished so drastically that it made my heart ache. He barely seemed to register the significance of the gathering. Ethan arrived last, looking uncomfortable in a suit that didn't quite fit his musician's frame. He gave me a quick hug before taking a seat as far from our parents as the seating arrangement allowed. Lawrence Peterson cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. Thank you all for gathering today. As you know, Harold has decided, given his health situation, to execute certain aspects of his estate plan now rather than waiting. He believes this will ensure a smoother transition and allow him to see his wishes fulfilled during his lifetime. Peterson began reading through standard legal provisions, executor appointments, tax considerations, charitable bequests to Harold's favorite organizations. I listened intently, waiting for the details that would impact the family business. Regarding Blake Real Estate Holdings, Peterson continued, Harold has already transferred operational control to Richard, as you all know. However, ownership shares were to be distributed upon Harold's passing according to the following percentages: 40% to Richard, 20% to Amanda, 20% to Ethan, and 20% to Jillian. My heart lifted slightly at the word were. At least Grandpa had initially intended for US to share equally in the business. However, Peterson said, adjusting his glasses again, as part of Harold's revised estate plan, executed 3 months ago when he transferred power of attorney to Richard, a significant distribution has already taken place. Peterson lifted a document from his portfolio. Harold has gifted Jillian Blake $5 million in liquid assets and real estate holdings, including the Westbrook development, the Sheffield apartment complex, and the Newport vacation property. The room began to spin slightly. Those were the exact properties I had been managing for the past 5 years. Properties that were supposed to be divided among all the grandchildren. And the Westbrook development wasn't even completed yet. It was the project I had poured my heart into, researching environmental impact, working with local officials, and designing a mixed-use community that would provide both luxury and affordable housing. These assets, Peterson continued, have been removed from the estate distribution and are now solely owned by Jillian Blake. That's not possible, I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. Those properties were specifically mentioned in Grandpa's original estate plan as being divided among all of us. My father stepped forward, his expression a practiced mix of sympathy and firmness. Amanda, your grandfather, and I discussed this at length. The reality is that Jillian has demonstrated exceptional business acumen over the past year. Furthermore, with you and David both having established careers and Ethan pursuing his music, Jillian simply has greater financial needs at this stage. Greater financial needs. Ethan repeated incredulously, finally engaging with the proceedings. She lives in a company-paid penthouse and has never worked a day in her life outside the cushy job you gave her. Jillian's face flushed with anger. That's not fair. I've been working closely with Dad on major projects. Just because I don't broadcast every little accomplishment like Amanda doesn't mean I haven't earned this. Earned. I couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in it. Jillian, you couldn't even explain how a cap rate works last year, and suddenly you've earned $5 million in assets? My mother intervened, her voice carrying that warning tone I'd heard throughout childhood. Amanda, this is exactly the kind of reaction that concerned your grandfather. This competitiveness, this inability to be happy for your sister's success. Success? I stood up, blood pounding in my ears. What success? What has she actually accomplished besides being your favorite? Peterson awkwardly shuffled his papers. Perhaps we should take a brief recess too. No, I interrupted, moving toward his desk. I want to see the transfer documents.
Now.
After a moment's hesitation and a nod from my father, Peterson handed me the paperwork. There it was in black and white. My father's signature as power of attorney, authorizing the transfer of assets that had been meant for all of us to Jillian alone. The date on the document coincided with the period when Grandpa Harold's health had supposedly taken a dramatic turn for the worse. This is wrong, I said quietly, scanning the pages. Grandpa would never have wanted this. He believed in fairness. People change their minds, Amanda, my father said smoothly, especially when they see who truly values the family legacy versus who might be distracted by outside interests. He glanced meaningfully at David. The injustice of it all, years of hard work dismissed, my dedication to the company treated as a hobby, assets I had managed successfully handed to my sister who had shown no real interest until recently. It was overwhelming. I felt tears threatening and fought them back. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. And that's when it happened. From his wheelchair in the corner, Grandpa Harold slowly pushed the blanket off his knees. With effort but surprising steadiness, he rose to his feet. His nurse gasped and moved toward him, but he waved her away with a firm hand. "That's enough," he said, his voice stronger and clearer than I had heard it in over a year. The room fell silent. My father's face drained of color. "Dad, you shouldn't be exerting yourself," he said quickly. "Let's get you back to your room where you can rest." Grandpa Harold fixed my father with a stare that could have frozen fire. "I've been watching you all very carefully. The will you just heard is a fake." The silence that followed was absolute. My mother's hand flew to her pearl necklace, a nervous habit from childhood. Jillian looked like she might faint. My father stood perfectly still, like a predator, hoping to avoid detection. "Mr. Blake," Peterson began cautiously, "I assure you these are the documents you signed when I was supposedly suffering from dementia?" Grandpa Harold interrupted, his voice gaining strength with each word. "When I supposedly couldn't make decisions for myself. Richard, did you really think I wouldn't find out what you've been doing?" My father started to speak, but Grandpa Harold raised his hand. "Save it. I have proof of everything. The embezzlement, the falsified accounting, the offshore accounts, every last dirty deal you've made behind my back for the past decade." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver thumb drive, holding it up like a trophy. "It's all here. And Judge Franklin has another copy in his safe. One phone call from me, and it all goes to the district attorney." My world was collapsing and rebuilding itself simultaneously. My Grandpa Harold had been testing us all along. And my parents had failed spectacularly. The library erupted into chaos. My mother began sobbing dramatically while my father attempted to approach Grandpa Harold, only to be stopped by a look so fierce it halted him mid-stride. Jillian sat frozen, her perfectly made-up face a mask of shock. Ethan moved to stand beside me, our shoulders touching in a silent show of solidarity that we hadn't shared since childhood. "Everyone sit down," Grandpa Harold commanded, and remarkably, everyone obeyed. Even my father, the man who had been running our family and business with an iron fist, sank into the nearest chair like a scolded child. "I'll start from the beginning," Grandpa said, moving with surprising agility to take the seat at the head of the long library table, his traditional place during family meetings. 14 months ago, I began noticing irregularities in the quarterly financial reports. Properties that should have been generating substantial income were showing minimal returns. Development costs for new projects were inexplicably inflated. Money was moving through our accounts in patterns that made no sense for legitimate business. He looked directly at my father. "At first, I thought you were simply making poor decisions. But Thomas Franklin, you remember my old friend who became a judge? He suggested something more concerning might be happening." My father's face had gone from pale to ashen. Judge Franklin had been Grandpa's friend for over 50 years and was known for his expertise in financial crimes. "Thomas put me in touch with a forensic accountant and a private investigator," Grandpa continued. "What they uncovered was far worse than I imagined. Richard, you've been systematically draining assets from Blake Holdings for at least 8 years. Millions siphoned into shell companies and offshore accounts under various aliases." My mother found her voice. Though it shook with emotion or calculation, it was impossible to tell which. "Harold, you're confused. Richard has grown the company's official value. The annual reports show what Richard wanted them to show." Grandpa cut her off. "The real numbers tell a different story. We should be worth nearly twice what we are on paper." He turned to Peterson, who looked profoundly uncomfortable. "Lawrence, I'm disappointed in you. You had to have suspected something wasn't right with those documents I supposedly signed." Peterson swallowed hard. "Mr. Blake, I was assured you were having lucid periods when major decisions were made. Given your medical reports that were exaggerated by specialists who mysteriously received large donations to their research foundations from anonymous sources." Grandpa raised an eyebrow. "Those medical reports?" My mind was racing, connecting dots that had been floating disconnected for years. The restricted access to Grandpa, the new doctors, the sudden changes in company structure. So, you've been pretending? All this time? I asked, still struggling to reconcile the sharp, strategic man before me with the foggy, confused grandfather I'd been visiting. Grandpa's expression softened as he looked at me. Not entirely pretending, Amanda. I am 84. I do have some cognitive challenges, but nothing like what they've led everyone to believe. He smiled slightly. I've been careful to appear more impaired when certain people were watching. He turned back to my father. I needed to know how far you would go. Would you stop at cooking the books, or would you try to manipulate my final wishes too? So, I created the perfect test. I pretended to decline more rapidly. I allowed you to think you had control. My father finally spoke, his businessman's composure partially restored. Dad, this is ridiculous. I've made some aggressive tax maneuvers, certainly, but nothing illegal. As for the will, you and I discussed the changes. You agreed. Jillian showed promise. Richard, stop. Grandpa's voice was quiet but cut like a knife. The game is over. My investigator has documented transfers totaling $27 million to accounts that ultimately trace back to you and Diane. Not to the company. Not to family trusts. To your personal control. He nodded to his nurse, who left the room briefly and returned with a distinguished older man I didn't recognize. This is Michael Donovan, former FBI financial crimes specialist. He's been building the case for nearly a year. Donovan nodded professionally. We have transaction records, communication logs, and testimony from 3 former employees who were pressured to falsify documents. The evidence is conclusive. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was potentially criminal. Jillian suddenly burst into tears, not the calculated, delicate tears she typically deployed when things weren't going her way, but ugly, gasping sobs. I didn't know, she cried, mascara streaming down her face. I mean, I knew something wasn't right with some of the paperwork Dad had me sign, but he said it was just tax optimization. Grandpa Harold regarded her coolly. You knew enough, Jillian. Those tax forms you signed authorized the transfer of assets out of the country. Your signature is on documents creating shell companies in the Caymans. She was just doing what I told her. My father interjected sharply. Leave her out of this. Like you left Amanda out? Grandpa countered. The only person who actually showed genuine business acumen and ethical judgment? The one you deliberately sidelined, because she might have noticed what you were doing? Hearing this validation from Grandpa, confirmation that I hadn't imagined the years of being overlooked and undermined, released something tight in my chest. David reached for my hand under the table. The will you heard today is completely fabricated, Grandpa continued. My actual estate plan is quite different, and it remains unchanged from what I decided 5 years ago. He nodded to Donovan, who produced another folder of documents. Blake Holdings will be placed in a family trust, Grandpa explained. Amanda will serve as primary trustee, with Ethan as secondary trustee. Operational decisions will require approval from both trustees. Richard and Diane, you are removed from all leadership positions, effective immediately. My parents stared in stunned silence. My father's calculating mind was visibly racing, looking for an angle, an escape route. You can't do this, he finally said. You legally transferred power of attorney to me. These new documents won't stand up in court. Power of attorney obtained through fraud and misrepresentation of my mental capacity. Grandpa smiled thinly. Judge Franklin has already reviewed the evidence. The medical assessment I underwent last week, without your knowledge, confirms I am fully competent to make these decisions. He turned to me and Ethan. There's one more thing you should know, and it may be the hardest truth of all. He took a deep breath. Richard is not my biological son. If you're still with me through this family nightmare, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Has anyone else discovered their family wasn't what they thought it was? When my grandfather dropped this bombshell, my entire understanding of our family history shattered. Stay with me as I explain the shocking truth about my father's parentage and how it explains decades of resentment and deception. This revelation changed everything about how I viewed my family legacy. The silence that followed Grandpa Harold's announcement was deafening. My father sat completely still, his face unreadable. My mother looked away, studying her manicured nails as if they held the secrets of the universe. "What are you talking about?" Ethan finally asked, his voice unusually quiet. Grandpa Harold's expression held decades of contained pain. "Your grandmother Eleanor and I had been married for 3 years without conceiving a child. We were going through testing to determine the cause when she suddenly announced she was pregnant. I was overjoyed, never questioning the timing." He paused, his gaze distant with memory. "It was only after Eleanor died of cancer when Richard was 17 that I found her journals. She had had a brief affair with my business partner, Charles Whitmore. Richard was the result." My father's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "I made the decision to keep this knowledge to myself," Grandpa continued. "Richard had already lost his mother. I couldn't bear to tell him I wasn't his biological father, especially since I had raised him and loved him as my own from the moment he was born." "If you loved him so much," my mother interjected sharply, "why reveal this painful secret now, in front of everyone?" Grandpa's eyes hardened. "Because Richard has used preserving the Blake family legacy as justification for every manipulative, underhanded action he's taken. He's wielded the Blake name like a weapon against his own children, favoring one over the others based on who he could more easily control." He looked directly at my father. "But the truth is, you've never understood what the Blake legacy truly means because you've never had to build anything yourself." My father finally spoke, his voice deadly calm. "So, this is your revenge? Announcing that I'm a bastard and cutting me out of the company I've run for 15 years? "This isn't revenge, Richard. It's accountability," Grandpa replied. "And I'm not cutting you out entirely. You and Diane will retain 15% ownership in the trust, providing income but no management authority. The company will be led by Amanda and Ethan, with my guidance for as long as I'm able to provide it." "And Jillian?" my mother asked pointedly. "Jillian will retain 10% ownership and her current role for a probationary period. Her future in the company will depend on her choices moving forward." Jillian wiped her tears, looking uncertainly between our parents and Grandpa Harold. "This is preposterous," my father declared, standing abruptly. "I'll contest this in court. I'll expose your mental decline." "Please do," Grandpa interrupted calmly. "And I'll ensure the district attorney receives the complete file on your financial crimes." How do you think the Westbrook investors will react when they learn their money was partially diverted to your personal accounts in Grand Cayman? The threat hung in the air, its implications unmistakable. My father, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, had no countermove. "We're going home to discuss our options," my mother announced, gathering her purse with trembling hands. "Jillian, come with us." Jillian hesitated, looking between our parents and Grandpa Harold. "Jillian," my mother repeated sharply. After a moment's hesitation, Jillian followed our parents from the room. The heavy library door closed behind them with a sound like the period at the end of a complicated sentence. The dinner that evening was possibly the most excruciating experience of my life. Grandpa Harold had insisted we all stay at Lakeview Manor to begin the transition process, as he called it. My parents and Jillian arrived last to the dining room, having apparently spent the afternoon in intense private discussion. The massive oak table that could seat 24 comfortably now felt both too large for our small group and too confining to contain the tension radiating between us. We ate in near silence, the only sounds the clink of silverware against fine china and the occasional direction to pass the salt or wine. Ethan kept shooting me questioning glances across the table, clearly as uncomfortable as I was. After the main course had been cleared, Grandpa Harold spoke. "Tomorrow morning, we'll meet with the board to announce the leadership changes. Amanda, I'd like you to prepare a brief statement about your vision for the company moving forward." My father's knife clattered against his dessert plate. "This is still precipitous, Dad. The board has worked with me for years. They won't simply accept Amanda stepping in without question. They will when they understand the alternative is a public scandal and potential criminal charges," Grandpa replied evenly. Most of them have their own investments tied up in Blake Holdings. They'll choose stability and discretion. Later that evening, Ethan found me in the garden gazebo, where I'd retreated to call David and process the day's revelations. He sat beside me on the cushioned bench, looking up at the stars visible through the gazebo's glass ceiling. "So," he said after a moment, "apparently we're business partners now." Despite everything, I laughed. "Apparently. I know nothing about real estate development," he admitted. "You know more than you think. And you have good instincts about people, which is half the battle." I turned to look at him. "Are you okay with all of this? You've always been clear about wanting your own path." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I think I'm actually relieved. Music will always be my passion, but I've been struggling in LA. Too many talented people, not enough opportunities." He shrugged. "Maybe this is the universe telling me it's time for a different approach. I can still make music while helping with the family business." "Co-trustees," I mused. "Grandpa was smart to structure it that way. Neither of us can make major decisions alone." "Checks and balances," Ethan agreed. "Something our parents never allowed." The following morning, Grandpa Harold invited me to his private study, a room I hadn't been permitted to enter for months. Unlike the imposing library, this space was intimate and personal, with worn leather chairs and walls lined with family photographs rather than leather-bound legal tomes. He unlocked an antique cabinet and removed a weathered photo album I'd never seen before. As we sat together on his small sofa, he began showing me images from the early days of Blake Holdings, construction sites, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, handshake deals captured in fading color. "Your grandmother Eleanor was my heart," he said softly, pointing to a beautiful woman with a warm smile standing beside him in front of their first major development. "When I discovered her affair after her death, it nearly destroyed me. Not just the betrayal, but the fact that she'd taken the truth to her grave." "Is that why you and Dad always seemed strained? Even before the financial issues?" I asked. Grandpa nodded slowly. "I try not to let it affect how I treated him. But perhaps some part of me was always looking for Eleanor's betrayal in Richard's face. And Richard, he always sensed something was missing between us, though he never knew why." He turned the page to reveal photos of my father as a young man, graduating from college, joining the family business. I should have told him the truth when he was old enough to understand. Secrets like this poison families across generations. Like the secret that my parents have been embezzling from the company? I asked, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. "Yes," Grandpa acknowledged. "Though I suspect that particular crime has a simpler motivation. Your father has expensive tastes, and your mother's family lost their money 2 generations ago. Her social status has always depended entirely on the Blake fortune." He closed the album gently. "But there's something else you need to understand, Amanda. Richard isn't biologically a Blake, but he is my son in every way that matters. I raised him, taught him, loved him. His actions are his own responsibility, but the distance between us, that's partially my failure." The complexity of family relationships had never felt more profound. Grandpa Harold had kept a devastating secret for decades out of love, yet that very secret had created an emotional gulf that perhaps drove my father to his own deceptions. "What happens now?" I asked quietly. "Now we rebuild," Grandpa replied. "The company, yes, but more importantly, the family, or at least the parts that can be salvaged." Before I could respond, there was a sharp knock at the study door. Ethan entered, his expression troubled. "You need to come downstairs," he said urgently. "Dad's gone through Grandpa's office. He's destroying documents." The weeks following what our family would come to call the revelation were some of the most challenging of my life. My parents declared all-out war, both legal and emotional. They moved out of Lakeview Manor the day after my father was caught shredding documents, taking up residence in their Manhattan penthouse, and hiring Stanley Rothman, one of the most aggressive attorneys in New York. Grandpa Harold temporarily moved in with David and me while the legal situation stabilized. Our modest colonial suddenly felt both too small for his larger-than-life presence and strangely more like home with him there, drinking coffee at our kitchen table and sharing stories of his early days in real estate. The first salvo in my parents' legal offensive was a petition challenging Grandpa's mental competence. Despite the independent medical assessment confirming his capacity, they submitted affidavits from the specialists they had previously engaged, all suggesting that Grandpa Harold suffered from significant cognitive decline with occasional periods of lucidity. Judge Franklin, true to his friendship with Grandpa, ensured the case was assigned to Judge Rebecca Martinez, known for her no-nonsense approach to family disputes. She ordered a comprehensive evaluation by a court-appointed geriatric psychiatrist who ultimately confirmed what we already knew. Grandpa Harold had some age-related memory issues, but was fundamentally sound in his decision-making capacity. With the competency challenge defeated, my parents shifted tactics. Rothman filed for an emergency injunction to prevent any changes to the company leadership structure, claiming that my father had been operating under a valid power of attorney and that the sudden reorganization would cause irreparable harm to the business interests of Blake Holdings. Meanwhile, Jillian launched what could only be described as a social media smear campaign. Carefully worded posts about elder abuse and manipulative relatives taking advantage of my beloved grandfather began appearing on her Instagram and Facebook accounts. Though she never named me directly, the implications were clear to anyone who knew our family. "Can you believe this?" I asked David one evening, showing him Jillian's latest post, a throwback photo of her and Grandpa with the caption, "Some people will do anything for money and power, even turning family members against each other. Heartbroken, but staying strong for you, Grandpa." David set aside the essays he was grading and read the post, his expression darkening. "She's playing the victim while your parents were the ones stealing millions. The irony is almost impressive. The toll on our marriage was subtle but real." David had always been my rock, but the constant stress of legal proceedings, emergency business meetings, and family drama was testing both our patience. Late nights poring over company financial records meant less time together. The emotional weight I carried home each day created a heaviness that was difficult to escape even in our most intimate moments. "I'm sorry," I whispered one night after snapping at him over something trivial, a forgotten grocery item, if I recall correctly. "I don't mean to bring all this home with me." "Hey," he said, pulling me into his arms. "For better or worse, remember? This is the worst part. We'll get through it." Ethan surprised everyone with how quickly he adapted to his new role in the company. While I focused on operations and development, he took over investor relations and marketing, areas where his natural charisma and creativity proved unexpectedly valuable. He moved back from Los Angeles, taking an apartment near the office and throwing himself into learning the business with an enthusiasm I'd never seen him direct toward anything except music. "It turns out I'm pretty good at this corporate stuff," he told me over lunch in the company cafeteria about a month after the revelation. Who knew explaining complex real estate investments to nervous investors wasn't that different from convincing club owners to book an unknown band? His support became even more crucial when the court hearings began in earnest. The preliminary injunction had been denied, but my parents' attorney had filed a more substantial lawsuit challenging the new trust arrangement on multiple grounds. Each hearing meant more family secrets exposed in the sterile environment of the courthouse, with court reporters dispassionately transcribing every painful detail. The wider community's reaction to the unfolding Blake family drama was mixed. Some longtime business associates distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the allegations of financial impropriety. Others, particularly those who had experienced my father's cutthroat business tactics firsthand, seemed almost vindicated by his downfall. Extended family members chose sides, with most of my mother's relatives predictably supporting my parents, while Grandpa Harold's few surviving relatives rallied behind him. Holiday gatherings, once obligatory if not particularly warm, were now completely fractured, with competing invitations and pointed absences. Through it all, Grandpa Harold maintained a dignity that was nothing short of remarkable. Despite the public airing of his wife's infidelity, his son's betrayal, and his own decision to conceal the truth for decades, he never showed embarrassment or resentment. He testified when required, answered questions honestly, and refused to engage in the kind of emotional mudslinging my parents had embraced. "The truth doesn't need embellishment or defensive anger," he told me one evening as we reviewed case documents at my dining room table. "It simply needs to be stated clearly and consistently." About 6 weeks into the legal proceedings, I was working late at the office when I received a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of a diary page in my mother's distinctive handwriting, dated nearly 30 years earlier. "Harold cornered me today about the Westlake project numbers. He suspects something is off but doesn't yet realize how deep it goes or how long Richard has been adjusting the books. I convinced him it was an accounting error. He trusts me still, though less than before. Richard says we need to accelerate the plan. I'm afraid of what that means." The text message following the photo simply read, "There's more where this came from. Meet me at Riverside Park, bench near the 79th Street Boat Basin. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Come alone." I stared at my phone, heart racing. This was evidence that the financial manipulation had been going on far longer than even Grandpa suspected. But it could also be a trap of some kind. After consulting with our attorneys and Grandpa Harold, I agreed to the meeting with precautions in place. Ethan would be nearby, watching from a distance, and our private investigator would be positioned with a clear view of the area. The next day, wrapped in a wool coat against the November chill, I sat on the designated bench overlooking the Hudson River. At exactly 2 p.m., a figure in a hooded jacket approached and sat beside me. When they lowered the hood, I was shocked to see my mother's personal assistant, Greta, a woman who had worked for our family for over 20 years. "I don't have much time," she said, her German accent more pronounced than usual, suggesting stress. "Your mother would fire me immediately if she knew I was here." "Why are you doing this?" I asked. Greta looked out at the water, her profile sharp against the gray sky. "I have respected your Grandpa Harold for many years. What your parents are doing, it's not right. I've watched, said nothing for too long." She handed me a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. "Your mother's diaries. 3 of them, spanning 25 years. She thinks they're locked in her personal safe, but I've had copies of her keys for emergencies." She stood abruptly. "I was never here. You never saw me." Before I could thank her, she was walking briskly away, disappearing among the other park visitors. The diaries proved to be explosive. My mother had meticulously documented years of financial manipulation, starting small but growing increasingly brazen as my father gained more control of the company. There were references to offshore accounts, falsified projections, and even instances of outright fraud in dealing with investors. More painful were the casual references to me and my siblings. Ethan was dismissed as hopeless for business purposes. I was described as too principled for her own good, just like Harold. And Jillian was characterized as perfectly malleable. She'll sign whatever Richard puts in front of her as long as she gets her allowance and attention. When our attorneys presented the diaries in court, the judge ordered forensic authentication. Once verified as genuine, they effectively demolished my parents' case. The evidence of long-term, deliberate financial crimes was overwhelming. Yet, even as we appeared to be winning the legal battle, a more disturbing reality emerged. Working with forensic accountants, we discovered that over $2 million was simply gone, transferred through so many shells and fronts that tracing it became nearly impossible. The money had effectively vanished into the complex web of international banking. After one particularly grueling day of financial investigation, I returned home to find David waiting with a good bottle of wine and takeout from our favorite Italian restaurant. "You need a break," he said firmly, taking my briefcase and setting it aside. "Just one evening without Blake family drama." We were halfway through dinner when my phone rang. Seeing Ethan's number, I apologetically answered. "Mandy," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "Dad just called me. He wants to meet tomorrow. Just him and me." "What did you tell him?" I asked, setting down my wine glass. "I said I'd think about it." Ethan paused. "I think I should go." "Maybe he's finally ready to explain himself. Or maybe he's trying to divide us," I countered. "That's always been their strategy, play us against each other." "I know, but..." Ethan sighed. He's still our father, Mandy. Biological or not. Don't you want to understand why he did all this? The question hit me harder than I expected. Did I want to understand? Part of me wanted only justice, consequences, closure. But another part, the daughter who had once adored her father despite his flaws, desperately wanted explanations that might make sense of the betrayal. If you go, I said finally, I'm coming with you. The meeting never happened. The next morning, we received word that my father had boarded a private jet bound for a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. My mother claimed ignorance of his plans when questioned by authorities, though few believed her. The official investigation into Blake Holdings' finances was now moving from civil to criminal territory, with the FBI taking a direct interest in the case. In the midst of this chaos, a small miracle occurred. Amid a routine doctor's appointment, I discovered I was 8 weeks pregnant. David and I had been trying for nearly a year, and the timing seemed both terrible and perfect. New life emerging from the ashes of family destruction. When I told Grandpa Harold the news, his eyes filled with tears, the first I'd seen since the whole ordeal began. Life goes on, he said simply, placing his weathered hand over mine. That's the beauty of it. 1 year after the day Grandpa Harold stood up in the library and changed everything, we gathered again at Lakeview Manor, not for a will reading or legal proceeding, but for a different kind of family meeting. The grand house felt different now. We'd removed some of the more ostentatious artwork my mother had favored and opened up rooms that had long been closed off, letting light into spaces that had been shadowed for years. My father remained abroad, reportedly living in a villa in a country known for harboring wealthy fugitives. The FBI had frozen many of his known assets, but we all suspected he had planned his escape carefully, with resources hidden where they couldn't be easily traced. My mother had negotiated a settlement with prosecutors, agreeing to cooperate in exchange for avoiding jail time. She now lived in a modest apartment in Boston, all pretense of social prominence abandoned. The most surprising transformation had been Jillian's. After initially siding with our parents, she had experienced what appeared to be a genuine crisis of conscience. When federal investigators showed her the actual documents she had signed, papers that implicated her in potential felonies, the reality of her situation finally penetrated the protective bubble our parents had created around her. I didn't understand what I was doing, she told me tearfully during a difficult conversation 6 months earlier. Dad always said it was just aggressive tax planning, that everyone in our position did the same things. You're 30 years old, Jillian. I had responded, not unkindly but firmly. At some point, you have to take responsibility for your own choices. That conversation had marked the beginning of a tentative reconciliation. Jillian had entered therapy, moved out of the luxury apartment our parents had provided, and taken a legitimate position in the company's charitable foundation, work that seemed to genuinely engage her talents and interests. Now, as we sat around the dining table, Grandpa Harold at the head, with Ethan, Jillian, David, and me arranged around him, there was a sense of cautious optimism that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. My son Jacob, just 3 months old, slept peacefully in a bassinet beside my chair, his presence a constant reminder of life's continuity despite upheaval. I've asked you all here because I've made a decision about Lakeview Manor, Grandpa Harold announced once we had finished our meal. I'm selling it. The statement, delivered without preamble, stunned us all into silence. But this is the family home, Jillian protested. It's been in the Blake family for 3 generations. Exactly, Grandpa nodded. And it carries the weight of 3 generations of secrets, lies, and unhappiness. This house shaped all of us, and not always for the better. He looked around the table, his gaze lingering on each of us. The Blake legacy isn't this house, or even the company. It's what we build together moving forward. And I think we need fresh ground to build on. Over dessert, he unveiled architectural plans for 3 adjacent properties on a beautiful piece of land overlooking the same lake, but from the opposite shore. 3 homes. 1 for Grandpa Harold, 1 for David and me and our growing family, and 1 for Ethan, who had recently become engaged to a brilliant environmental lawyer he'd met through the company's sustainable development initiatives. "What about me?" Jillian asked quietly when she noticed there were only 3 homes planned. Grandpa Harold regarded her thoughtfully. "That depends on you, Jillian. Your probationary period with the foundation ends next month. The reports I've received suggest you found your calling there. If you choose to stay with a family and continue your current path, we'll build a 4th home. Or perhaps you'd prefer your own space elsewhere. The choice is yours." Jillian nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "I'd like to stay close to Jacob. I want to be a real aunt to him, not the kind of aunt our mother was to our cousins, sending expensive gifts but never really present." The business had stabilized under our joint leadership. Blake Holdings had weathered the scandal with remarkably little permanent damage, largely due to our transparency with investors and partners about what had happened and the changes we had implemented to prevent similar issues in the future. We had downsized some operations, sold off properties that held painful associations, and refocused on the kind of community-oriented development that had been Grandpa Harold's original passion. Ethan had found unexpected fulfillment in his business role, though he still played music on weekends at a local jazz club. David had continued teaching but had reduced his schedule to be more present for Jacob and to support me through the ongoing transitions. And I had discovered strengths I never knew I possessed: an ability to make difficult decisions, to lead through crisis, to rebuild what had been broken. Later that evening, as we stood on the terrace overlooking the lake, Grandpa Harold and I watched the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. "Do you regret it?" I asked him, revealing everything. It would have been easier to let it go, to preserve the family image. He considered the question, his weathered hands resting on the stone balustrade. "Easier in the short term, perhaps. But secrets don't disappear. They metastasize. Your father's dishonesty grew from the soil of my own deception about his parentage. Your mother's manipulations flourished in the shadows we all agreed not to illuminate." He shook his head. "No, Amanda. Truth is always worth the pain it causes." He glanced back at the house where David was showing Ethan how to properly hold Jacob. "Besides, look what has emerged from the wreckage. Something authentic. Something with a foundation built on honesty rather than appearances." The following spring, we broke ground on the new properties. The ceremony was simple, just the 5 of us and Jacob, now crawling and babbling excitedly. Jillian had earned her place in the family circle, her work with the foundation showing genuine promise, and her relationship with Ethan and me healing slowly but steadily. Grandpa Harold insisted we each turn a shovelful of earth, including Jacob, whose tiny hands I guided around the handle of a miniature shovel. "New foundations," Grandpa said, watching his great-grandson with evident joy. "That's what matters in the end." As I look back on the incredible journey our family has taken, from betrayal to redemption, I wonder about your experiences with family justice. Has karma ever delivered a perfect moment of truth in your family? Whether it was a dramatic confrontation like ours or a quiet realization, I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Family may be complicated, but as my grandfather taught me, truth is always worth fighting for, even when it hurts. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real family stories. And remember, sometimes what seems like the end of everything is actually the beginning of something better. Thank you for listening to my journey. Your support means everything as I continue building my new legacy based on honesty rather than appearances.